Well, good morning again, everybody. We're in the final stretch, and we chose inflation as one of the last topics to talk about, because we don't really think it's that important. So otherwise, we would have put it in the beginning. So we know that large increases in prices over this year have raised serious concerns from many economists, commentators, policymakers, and the public about perhaps a galloping inflation. The Federal Reserve has aggressively responded to the call for action by increasing interest rates, and Chairman Powell has indicated 3 days ago it will continue increasing interest rates until inflation is tamed. This kind of Federal Reserve statements worsen the concerns of the public, as these are reflected in the University of Michigan's monthly sentiment survey of consumers' expected inflation. The latest expected inflation for next year, which was just reported 3 days ago, is to run 5.4%, which represents an uptick from the previous month. Now, this panel is here to tell you that the Fed's policy of increasing interest rates is inappropriate. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine notwithstanding, current economic conditions are not that dissimilar from earlier periods when the Fed raised interest rates too early. Focusing on rising prices without carefully examining the underlying causes leads to the wrong policy response. If you consider various measures of the economy's performance, such as the employment-population ratio or the employment-to-population of skilled labor ratios, they are not following the trend of the pre-pandemic period, let alone the very much below level of capacity utilization and the potential output gap. Unfortunately, the Fed is relying on theories that are little supported by the evidence. As we all know, inflation is a composite number, an index. It represents numerous transactions across the economy. When you disaggregate this index, you can see, and many times you cannot see, but impute, as Randy will explain, what really is going on. Everybody knows that there have been large jumps in prices of energy and food that no economist, no central banker, or the US president can have any influence. They can be traced to a greater extent to supply chain disruptions, especially with the lockdowns in China, and I hope Yeva will go into that, caused by both the war in Ukraine and the pandemic crisis. Economists, because of the volatility of both energy and food, focus on the underlying inflation, the core inflation as it's called, that excludes energy and food. The motivation for monitoring the core inflation measure is that headline inflation, that is the CPI, is subject to large transitory shocks unrelated to changes in cyclical inflation pressures or the public's confidence in the central bank's commitment to long-run price stability. I want to underscore this public's confidence in the central bank's commitment to long-run stability, because I'll come back to that later. But core inflation that central bankers use for determining policy has been problematic during this period, the post-pandemic and the war in Ukraine period. And this because there have been high fluctuations in other prices as well, like new and used cars, car parts, delivery services like laundry and dry cleaning, airfares, other transportation services, and a host of other transactions that use lots of energy, where the prices have risen by double digits in the past 12 months. There are also other high fluctuations on imputed transactions that Randy will talk about, that they are significant parts of determining inflation that are more problematic, like, for instance, the owner-occupied housing. That is yet another important aspect of the current inflation conditions that we haven't thought about it, but I think it's extremely important, which is due to the altered corporate behavior in regards to profit markups. The increasing prices of energy, food, and in general the supply chain disruptions have provided increasing pricing power and higher profits, as this figure indicates. Now you can see the spike. What it shows is that the acceleration in the increase in prices is being driven by corporate profits, even though economists such as some guy by the name of Larry Summers, along with Jason Furman, claim it to be an unscientific approach to dealing with inflation. There is evidence, however, that corporations are using the current inflationary condition as an excuse to raise prices more, since they do not necessarily have any competitors, either domestic or foreigners, that could force them to keep prices down. The surprising aspect of this is that even the Fed economists recognize it and have written about it, and yet do not consider it as an important factor causing inflation. Recent articles in The Guardian and the Wall Street Journal reported that a significant percentage, close to over 60%, of the largest US publicly traded corporations had the highest profit margins this year than they did in 2019 in the pre-pandemic period. Even Fed Chairman Jerome Powell has stated that large corporations with near monopolistic power are raising prices because they have the opportunity to do so. In a recent paper by Storm, using other measures such as the PPI, the Producers Price Index, or the unit cost, his econometric results show that this inflation is in large part a profit-driven inflation. Central bank economists use and monitor the personal consumption expenditure, the PCE index, for monetary policy action. But they are not very happy with that because that has dramatic fluctuations. So they have been searching for better measures to smooth out those wild fluctuations that appear in the core inflation. And I use one as an example, the one that's developed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, which they call the Trim Mean PCE. The Trim Mean rate of inflation is defined as the average rate of inflation after trimming away a certain percentage of the distribution of price changes from both ends of the distribution. So according to the Dallas Fed, the Trim Mean inflation is a superior policy tool because it is less biased as a real estimator of headline inflation, and because it more successfully filters out headline inflation's transitory variations leaving only cyclical and trend components. Now, what are some of the transactions that are trimmed away? Besides energy and food, it excludes such things as jewelry, watches, sporting goods, used cars and trucks, car parts, flowers and seeds, computer software, amusement parks and movie theaters, proprietary hospitals, and a whole roster of other things. Those of you who are interested to see the details, because it's a huge numbers, you can look at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas website. However, it still includes items that are imputed. Now let me just show you, if you compare the difference between the normal PCE, the PCE that excludes energy and food, and then the trim mean. And you can see it for 1 month, you can see it for 6 months, and for 12 months. Now you will notice that the core inflation has been highly variable. So I also want to show you the difference between the PCE that excludes energy and the trim mean index. Now, you will notice that if you look at this, the underlying inflation during this period, if you take the alternative measure, is that everyone is concerned, is between 3.5 to 4%. In the Reagan presidency years, the Fed, after the Volcker-engineered recession, did not appear to be that uncomfortable about an inflation rate being around 4%, which was above the target of 2%. And finishing, let me say that this brings me to the question about the established target of 2%, which the Fed, the ECB, and other central banks use as inflation target. Why is 4 or 5% inflation considered excessive, and 2% is determined as a target to maintain? We also know that during Alan Greenspan's Fed, he advocated a 0% inflation. Now, a good number of economists, including the same guy, Larry Summers, advocated that the Fed must adopt a positive inflation rate to preserve its ability to fight recessions, even though until recently, the federal funds rate was 0. Now, as many economists, there have been many economists have suggested that the 2% inflation rate is actually 0, because inflation measures understate the benefits of technological progress. Now, I am sure you can surmise that the 2% target was chosen mainly to give the Fed and other central bankers room to act, or in other words, provide them with credibility. Many other economists have suggested that inflation targets should be raised. Oliver Blanchard comes to mind, a neoclassical economist, who in 2010, when he was the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, proposed an inflation target of 4%, and others followed suit, arguing for a similar target for the ECB to adopt. Now, I'm going to end with this. Blanchard raised the following question in 2010. Are the net costs of inflation much higher at 4% than at 2%? So I will stop here and leave you to ponder this question. Thank you very, very much.
All right, so I titled my presentation, Does MMT Have an Inflation Problem? Because that seems to be a common refrain among certain critics of MMT, that MMT has first ignored inflation, that we don't have anything to say about inflation. That was always, even before the current inflationary situation, that was always supposedly the missing part from MMT, and a usual critique of people who I would say had not read a lot of MMT literature. And then the second claim more recently is that implementing MMT, whatever that means, during the pandemic is to blame for the current inflation. So that's why Larry Summers can claim that MMT basically has been discredited and nobody should be paying attention to it anymore. Well, I would argue that MMT has always emphasized inflation, because MMT has always emphasized that the real resource space is what constrains spending, that real resources are the true limit to spending, and that if you spend too much, that's not going to lead to higher interest rates, as neoclassical economists or mainstream economists claim, but rather, and it's not going to lead to insolvency and all the other problems that come with too much spending, supposedly, but instead that too much spending would manifest itself in the form of inflation. That's always been the MMT claim. We've also argued that you can get inflation before you reach that true constraint because of bottlenecks. That's always been part of the MMT literature, and that's why MMT has advocated for different kinds of policies rather than just, pumping the prime and injecting indiscriminate spending into the economy and so on. In fact, Bill Mitchell has a couple of pieces on the Weimar Republic and Zimbabwe, the hyperinflation that happened there, arguing that both of these were supply-side phenomena, that you had major contractions on the supply side, so your real resource space had contracted in both of these episodes, and that's what led to these hyperinflations that we observed. So to say that MMT has an inflation problem in that it has never talked about inflation is wrong and disingenuous in my opinion. The second point is about implementing MMT during the pandemic. And of course, what we did during the pandemic was necessary, so the fiscal stimulus. But if MMT economists were to design it, it would probably take a different form. So I would say the pandemic policy was more UBI than MMT, so universal basic income. I would say that you can qualify the response more like that than MMT. And MMT's argument against UBI has always been that it can potentially be inflationary. Now, back to our favorite economists, Larry Summers and Paul Krugman. I guess Stephanie started with them on the first day, and I have to end with them on the last day. So Larry Summers is credited with predicting that we would have disinflationary pressures, because leading up to the last round of fiscal relief spending, he argued that it was too much, it was going to be inflationary, so we had to sort of trim back that last stimulus package. Well, other economists, such as Paul Krugman, who were more dovish, they argued, well, we don't necessarily know. The economy might have more room to accommodate that spending. And if it appears that it didn't, then we always have the Fed, right? The Fed can intervene, and it's going to solve our inflation problem. So the consensus now is that Summers was right, obviously, because we've seen the inflation, even though he might not have the right reasons for why the inflation was going to be persistent. And the time to raise interest rates was yesterday. The Fed should have raised interest rates sooner. That's another critique, and that now it's come to a point where it cannot achieve a lower inflation without causing inflation. Well, I would argue that both of those points are wrong. Demand is not driving inflation, as Larry Summers had argued, and that raising interest rates is not the right solution. So I'm going to focus mostly on the first part, and Randy will then talk about raising interest rates and the Fed's options for controlling inflation. So, have we reached our productive capacity? That's always a difficult question to answer because it's measuring potential GDP, as you all probably know, is not an easy task. And anytime we have a recession, we see that CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, lowers its estimates for potential GDP. So here I just have the estimates for 2021, the last quarter of 2021, and I also added the first quarter of 2022 just for May. And the very last row is our actual GDP. So in January of 2020, right, you have our actual GDP, our potential GDP was supposed to be something like 23.5 trillion, and then we lowered those estimates because of the pandemic, because CBO probably expected that the recession was going to last longer, and so our productive capacity was going to be affected by that. So they lowered the estimate, and then they started raising it back again when the economy performed much better, I would argue because of the fiscal intervention, than they would have expected. And then as of July of 2021, they had revised that number back up to the January 2020 levels. And I just got the May numbers, and you can see that they have revised them up much, much higher. And what we have at the very last row is our actual GDP. So if you had looked as of July of 2021, right, if you had looked at our actual GDP versus our potential GDP, you would say, well, we are already above our potential, right? And so that's what's causing inflation. But then you see with CBO's May revision that in the last quarter of 2021, we had not yet hit our potential GDP, right? If you look at the May numbers. So it's basically these two numbers here, and then you can see that the same holds for the first quarter of 2022, that we're close to that potential GDP, but we haven't yet surpassed that. So even by mainstream standards, we have not reached our productive capacity yet, right? And you can see that here in this graph that we have gotten close to our potential GDP. The blue line is potential GDP and the red one is actual GDP, but we have not yet surpassed it. And in fact, you can see that there have been many other periods previously where we've gotten really close and stayed there for a long period of time, right, without seeing the kinds of inflation that we see today. And this period right here in early 2000s, right, where we were sort of constantly at our potential without seeing much inflation at all. All right. The capacity utilization situation shows something similar, that our capacity utilization has obviously increased since the dire situation of the pandemic, but we have not even reached our peak that we reached in this recent recovery, in the post-global financial crisis recovery. And obviously you can see this downward trend in capacity utilization. If you look at capacity utilization by sectors, you see that something similar holds, that we have not really gotten to our averages in, say, the 1970s, 80s period. And then we haven't even gotten to our averages in the 80s and so on. So there is still a lot of room, as you can see here, to increase our capacity utilization, and we have not hit any kind of sort of productive capacity. I mean, if you look at labor force participation, you will see something similar there as well, that labor force participation has recovered, but we haven't even gotten to the pre-pandemic levels yet, and that holds true for prime age workers, holds true for men, women. There isn't just one group that you could say has left the sort of labor market and not returned. It's sort of spread very evenly. Now, one of the things we did in our inflation paper, Randy and I, that you might have seen, is we went and we looked at some survey data from the Atlanta Fed. It's called the Business Expectation Survey. They survey non-financial corporations, right, rather than just looking at what the financial markets think. They survey non-financial firms, medium-sized, small firms, large firms, and they ask them various questions about price pressures, what their expectations are for inflation, and what are some of the factors that are going to drive their pricing decisions going forward, okay? And one of the questions they ask is whether their sales are above normal, okay? Now, obviously you can see that during the pandemic sales were way below normal, but we also see that since the recovery, sales haven't gotten much above normal, right? So firms do not think that their sales are way above normal. So they don't see this kind of excess demand for their products that that economists think we have in the economy. Similarly, when they're asked whether they're going to raise their prices in the future and what are some of the factors that are going to push them in that direction, the influence of future sales is pretty muted, as you can see on this graph, right? We don't see firms saying, well, we're going to raise our prices in the future because sales are sort of out of line and we see this excess demand for our products and we're going to use that as an opportunity to raise prices, okay? At the same time, the firms surveyed by the Atlanta Fed, as late as February of 2022, report a lot of disruptions. So the kind of disruptions that we supposedly don't have in the economy, according to people like Summers and Furman. Well, if you ask the firms, they very much see disruptions, and they report that disruptions of supplier delays, locating alternate suppliers, and so on, have been very disruptive to their businesses. And the disruption in most cases is moderate to severe. All right. Now, one thing that I wanted to touch upon very briefly, and then I'll move on and show you the breakdown of what's causing CPI inflation, is the breakdown of the gross domestic product. And one thing in particular that I want to point out is imports, right? That how much we import has increased significantly if you compare the first quarter of 2020 to, say, the first quarter of 2022, okay? And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because MMT has always emphasized that in real terms, imports are a benefit because imports increase your productive space, right? They increase how much your population can, consume or use to invest and so on. So the real resources that you have access to, imports increase that, while exports do the opposite because you're producing output that you're shipping abroad, so you're shipping it to others to use. And in this case, we see that imports have increased by a lot, and that means that they have increased the productive output that's available to Americans to consume, and so to that extent, they have probably dampened the inflationary pressures that we could have seen otherwise. I think one of the things that the pandemic showed was that the MMT argument that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit, which I know if you're from a developing nation, you don't necessarily see it that way, but I think the pandemic showed very well that that's very much the case, right? We see countries restricting exports of grain and other products because they want to use it for their own populations, right? All sorts of export restrictions are creeping up now, which then shows you that they are really cost in real terms for a nation. All right. So this is the last graph that I'll show, and then I'll just talk a little bit about the Fed, and then I'll hand it to Randy. But this is just a breakdown of the CPI inflation. So if you break it down by component, and you see that transport has really been driving our inflation, the CPI inflation. So that's the green bar there. And I probably didn't have to tell you that, right? You would have guessed that that's transportation, which obviously includes oil and the price of cars and whatnot. And the other major component there, the yellow bars, that's imputed rentals for housing, something that Dimitri talked about. So that's not actual rentals. Actual rentals are there too. They are the gray bars. They have increased somewhat, but not as much as the imputed rentals. So this is basically the government's way of estimating how much you would have to pay to rent your own house, right? Because not everybody's a renter. A lot of people own their homes. Well, if we were to estimate how much it would cost for you to rent your home, right, that's what we're doing here. So it's not an actual number, right? It's not like the price of food that you can measure and say this is an actual sort of increase in prices. This is imputed, right? It's what Dimitri was referring to. All right. And of course, we've also seen food prices go up. That's the blue line at the very bottom. And I think this is where you can probably see the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine, manifest itself through the food prices in particular. But of course, all of this begs the question that if transport costs and imputed rentals and so on, those are the things driving inflation, what is it that the Fed is going to do about that with rate hikes, right? Randy will give you the answer, but I think the short answer is not much, right? So he will give you the longer answer. So I want to finish by basically, just talking about the Fed a little bit. The Fed has taken credit for low inflation, right? The story goes that Volcker broke the back of inflation, and then since then we've seen this moderate inflation, and it's all because of the Fed, because the Fed sort of raises rates at the right time, and and they don't, and then they sort of put the inflation genie back before it's gotten the chance to get out, and that's what's driven the low inflation. The reality, which the current pandemic shows, is that it's the globalized supply chains, right, which have allowed for offshoring, for the U.S. companies to tap into cheap labor resources abroad, to not have to deal with costs of regulations and taxes domestically. It's the just-in-time production, which lowers the cost of inventories. It's the stagnating demand that has prevailed in the past few decades with the jobless recoveries and the inability for workers to negotiate for higher wages. So those are the factors that have driven inflation low, right? It's not the Fed. And now that the pandemic has unraveled all of that, inflation has sort of come back to bite us, right? And so, I will just finish with that. I don't think the Fed can be credited with low inflation. All of these factors here, I think, have played a role. And Randy would probably say that in one word, you could say neoliberalism plus Wall Street, right? That's what's driven inflation low. And now all of that has come undone, and we are seeing the result of that in the higher inflation. All right. Here.
Okay. Here's a list of Levy publications by some combination of the three of us since 1994. You can see the first one there, 94, Flying Blind. You could say this is an obsession. So every few years we have to do it again. The third one, the Consumer Price Index as a measure of inflation, is the main one that goes through this issue. Dimitri promised I would talk about the imputed inflation. Actually, I did not plan to do that. So that is taken up in detail in that paper. So if you want to go through that. And the issue is that if you look at our high inflation periods, which is the early 70s and the late 70s, if you do a decomposition of the CPI to see what drives inflation, there are three items: oil, food, of course food is basically oil, literally, and imputed shelter. So imputed shelter is, as Yeva was explaining, what you would have to pay to rent your own home. Okay, so this does not show up in anybody's spending. Okay, and it can move the opposite direction, surprisingly, as rentals. So if the house prices are rising rapidly, that could possibly push people into rentals and cause the rents to go up. But they may move in opposite directions too. Okay, it turns out that those three items, again, even in this very, very strange inflationary period, were still the main items. You saw that, okay? There are also some quirky things like used cars that are included in the transportation. that for a while were rising very rapidly. It's a pretty small item, but that also is in the transportation. So anyway, it's the same sort of thing every time. So what I really wanted to focus on was sort of this transition of thinking among the orthodox economists and the transition to a different approach to monetary policy. All right. About a year ago, I don't remember the exact date, Jeremy Rudd, who was a Fed economist, wrote a very nice paper in which he said, nobody thinks clearly. That's why people hang on so tight to their beliefs and opinions, because compared to the haphazard way they're arrived at, even the goofiest opinion seems wonderfully clear, sane, and self-evident. Then he goes through 3 ideas. He says, everyone knows to be true, but they're errant nonsense. Aggregate production functions provide a good way to characterize the economy's supply side. Okay, that's the whole basis of neoclassical theory, right? Over a sufficiently long span, the economy will return to a state of full market clearing. And the theory of household choice provides a solid justification for downward sloping market demand curves. So these serve as the basis of orthodox theory and policy making, but none of these are all quotes, has any sort of empirical foundation. A lot of you know the Cambridge controversy, okay? No empirical foundation. Each is seriously deficient on theoretical grounds, yet economists continue to rely on these to organize their thinking. So the paper is fascinating. It exposes the entire corpus guiding orthodox economics as a fraud. All right, so what has happened over the past, since the days of Volcker? Orthodoxy abandoned Friedman's quantity theory. There just was no correlation between money and economic growth and money and inflation. And furthermore, the Fed and also the Bank of England were unable to hit their money targets when they adopted practical monetarism. So they abandoned that. And Rudd says the Fed has no theory of inflation, no plausible theory of what causes inflation. What the Fed did to replace monetarism was to embrace the new monetary consensus and a Taylor rule. So it comes down to expectations of inflation cause inflation. But how that works out, the Fed has no clue. Okay, why would that be true? Economists who accept this will frequently tell the story, if labor unions expect inflation, they demand wage increases. Well, that's not relevant to the United States at all. Labor unions are insignificant now, and they have no bargaining power. So this couldn't possibly be a story for today. Policy is supposed to work by controlling expectations. We control expectations through forward guidance. Earlier papers that Dimitri and I wrote about, and going through the transcripts of the Fed, you can see how this can put you right into a box, because you build the expectations that you're going to raise rates, and then there's no inflation. You have to raise the rates anyway. Okay, so you can trap yourself, and this is what the Fed did time and time again. I'll show a graph in just a minute. When inflation never appeared, but they had set the expectation that they were going to fight inflation by raising interest rates. And so then they raise them even when there's no inflation. Okay, and you read the transcripts, and they're discussing this. They know it's a bit of a problem, okay, that they're raising rates. But then they say, we have the argument. We're doing an even better job of fighting inflation because we raise rates even before there's any inflation. Okay, you can get great quotes out of the transcripts, which we've done in the past. So anyway, so you move the Fed funds rate to move the real rate, which goes back to the Vixelian idea, to a natural rate. In this series of papers, Flying Blind, what we're arguing, and Rudd says the same thing. The Fed is focusing on triple unobservables. Inflation expectations are unobservable. Now, there are some surveys, but the surveys are not of those who actually set the prices. Okay, so we can survey economists, right? They don't set the price. Okay, we don't have any good survey of the business people who actually set prices. Real interest rates, which are not observable because these are supposed to be forward, right? Ex post, yes, we could subtract inflation from the rate, but it's supposed to be forward looking, so we can't observe that. And natural rates, okay? When the Fed back in 1994 started talking about the natural rate, they were queried by reporters, and Greenspan admitted, we don't know what it is, but we will know it when we get there. Okay, trust us, we will know when we get there. And he admitted it can vary. Okay, so it's not a very useful concept. It's not observable. So policy is reduced to psyops. So you have psychological gamemanship to influence emotions, motives, and objective reasoning. This is Rudd arguing. Okay, alternative view of central bank policy. Over the course of this week, we've gone through most of this. So what's the MMT view of what monetary policy is all about? The central bank facilitates payments by and to the state. This was the first function of central banks. And it's still, of course, very important. It ensures payments systems function smoothly. Okay, that has been something that the Fed has focused on increasingly since the Great Depression. Make sure you don't have problems in the payment system. Lender of last resort operations, which is related to the payment system, and that goes back more than 100 years. Central banks need to intervene in a crisis. None of those things are really discretionary. Central banks must do these things. The central bank has one discretionary tool, which is the overnight interest rate target, and then that can indirectly affect market rates. Even conventional estimates show that lending and borrowing is normally not interest sensitive. Okay, if the mechanism is supposed to work through investment, but we know from both the aggregate data and also the microeconomic data that Steve Fazzari has done a lot of work on, for most firms, the interest rate doesn't really matter for the investment decision because uncertainty is so great. It swamps 400 basis points of interest rate. So it's not going to affect investment very much. Furthermore, interest rates enter the cost structure and form part of income so they can influence spending in a direction opposite to intended results. Oh, so for example, if you expect rates to go up, so the Fed is preparing you, that might actually accelerate purchases, right, and cause inflation rather than dampening it. But also the interest rates enter into costs, and so raising rates can be inflationary. And exactly how this will come out is going to depend a lot on who is the debtor in your economy. If the national government is the big debtor, raising rates will increase interest spending and could be inflationary. So that could apply to a country like Japan with not much private sector debt, a lot of government debt. On the other hand, if you have a lot of private debt and not much government debt, raising interest rates could possibly work, but they're also likely to cause a financial crisis. If you're already overly indebted, you move through the Minsky stages to Ponzi. The central bank can't control the money supply. This is not controversial anymore. There's weak empirical evidence for central bank control of inflation and expectations. Rudd goes through that and makes this argument too, and a weak link between expectations and inflation. So let's look at the data. Here is the blue line is the actual CPI inflation rate. You can see it spikes up. This is why everyone's worried. Expectations remained low, and it's pretty obvious they did not increase before inflation. So how could the expectations have caused the inflation? Okay, so my argument is that expectations, largely converge to reality. And so when inflation is very low, expectations of inflation will remain very low. When inflation picks up, eventually inflation expectations are going to pick up too. Fed rate hikes are not closely associated with inflation. If we look at inflation, it pretty much disappeared around 1985. Okay, we've had very stable inflation rates, but look at the Fed policy is the red. Okay, so the Fed is extremely active, and they're very proud of this. Okay, that is why inflation is low, supposedly. It's very clear they are not raising rates because inflation is going up. All right, the shaded areas are the recessions. There is a link there. The Fed always raises rates heading into a recession. Okay, this is the one sure thing, economic regularity. They always raise rates as we head into a recession. The timing is impeccable. The Fed raises rates when the deficit goes down. Okay, now from MMT, from sectoral balances when godly, when the deficit is going down, what is happening? The government is pulling demand out of the economy. We are headed for a recession. So what does the Fed do? It raises rates in order to increase the headwinds, okay, every time. And so, you might think the Fed would raise rates when deficits go up, okay, because if you believe deficits are inflationary, that would be the time to do it, but that's not what they do. They raise rates when the deficits go down. The orthodox view is central banks have to take away the punch bowl. When government spends too much, central bank has to reduce demand. Too much government spending increases the deficit and the debt, raising interest rates, causing inflation. But the Fed raises rates as the deficit falls. Interest rates are determined by monetary policy, not by deficits. Government debt, as you know, is private surplus. Government deficit debt don't necessarily cause inflation, so I'll present that on these points. So in general, the debt ratio has been going up for a generation. Interest rates have been going down over this period. So it's pretty clear that the debt ratio has not driven up interest rates. If you look at the correlation of short-term bond rates and long-term bond rates with the Fed's target, you see that the correlation is 99% for short-term bonds and 88% for long-term bonds. So it's pretty clear the Fed is determining the interest rates. It has nothing to do with bond vigilantes, has nothing to do with the debt ratios. You already know this, that a bigger deficit means that we save more. Government debt need not cause inflation. The debt ratio has been going up. The inflation rate has been on a downward trend. What about the current inflation? So this is just continuing what Yeva was arguing. Pandemic, recession, began as a collapse of supply. So this is unusual, that we have a recession caused by a collapse on the supply side. That then morphed into a collapse on the demand side. So the relief spending, the first round of this did not increase spending, private spending. It was used to pay bills and to increase saving. Our long paper goes through all the evidence for this. Okay, so the saving rates increased tremendously. The second round did restore spending. But that spending faced continuing supply side pressures, supply chains, price gouging, war and sanctions. So far, as of the time we wrote the paper, I think it's still true, wages are not keeping up with inflation. which means that we're not going to get into a wage price spiral, which is what the policymakers really fear. And the surveys show businesses are not facing abnormal demand, inventories are rebounding. Still, hiking rates is the wrong medicine, because what we need to do, and Biden is talking about this, now this is not a short-term solution, it's a long-term solution. Ramp up investment, increase domestic capacity, replace long and fragile supply chains. Yeva already showed this. We have more unused capacity than is typical in expansions of the past. We are in danger of reigniting stagflation. In the early 70s, this was caused by increasing the price of oil, food, and shelter, and it was fought by austerity, both fiscal and monetary policy austerity, which did not reduce inflation, but it did raise the unemployment rate. And so then we had a generation of high inflation and high unemployment. It clearly was not a problem of excess demand. We had high unemployment over that period. Volcker was given credit, raised interest rates above 20%, which for the United States is extremely high interest rates. And that led to a deep recession, a financial crisis, and a developing country debt crisis, which then came back to the United States, because who are the holders of a lot of the developing country debt? U.S. banks. So we had a savings and loan crisis, then we had a bank crisis in the United States. So all of this was the aftermath of trying to fight a recession, an inflation by causing a deep recession. Inflation did come down. Why did it come down? Because oil prices came down. Why did oil prices come down? In part because the US deregulated gas. So we increased the supply of gas and used that as an alternative to oil. Just by the way, if you compare the US and Japan in 1974, we had about the same energy efficiency or inefficiency, if you want to look at it that way. We used the same amount of energy to produce a unit of output as Japan. We chose recession, austerity, to fight the inflation. Japan chose energy conservation. They became twice as energy efficient as we were. And then they had a golden 2-decade period, right? Where America thought we were losing to Japan, all right? So the second oil price shock, we dealt with that a bit better, but conservation still would have been the right answer. And here we are 50 years later, still oil dependent, and it hits us again. So tackling supply side problems by attacking the demand side could reproduce stagflation. So the world faces unprecedented immediate challenges. Human survival is threatened. Yeva will talk in the afternoon about some of these challenges. We need coordinated, concerted effort, especially by the richest nations, because they are the source of most of the production, and also they are the source of most of the pollution. And Yeva will talk about how we can use the war experience to tackle the pandemics by mobilizing the resources to prepare for a transition. I'll stop. Thank you. They need the mic. But just a second to be
I suppose it's more of a clarifying question. Randy, you said when the government deficit shrinks, the Fed tends to raise rates. But from what I've seen in the UK and the US, when Clinton and Blair administrations ran a government surplus, the central banks generally cut rates in order to make up for that decrease in demand. Is that not the case? And if so, why was the Fed raising rates when deficits were shrinking?
Well, what the graph shows is that the Fed raises rates when the deficit goes down, not when it goes up. The interest rates are low over the, when we come out of a recession, in the recession, tax revenues fall sharply. So the deficit rises sharply. So we start to recover. But over the course of the recession, the Fed always cuts rates. So we're going to exit a recession with a rising deficit and low interest rates. All right? Then over the course of the expansion, the reverse happens. Our tax system is an extremely good automatic stabilizer. So Murphy was talking about the tax systems. Our tax system, federal taxes will rise at a pace of 20-25% per year at the peak of an expansion. In a way, it may be too pro-cyclical. But you do want the tax system to take demand out in a strong expansion, and ours does that. So we're automatically going to get a big deficit when tax revenue collapses when we move into a recession. One of our papers, I don't remember which one, has a graph that shows this, that tax revenue goes like this with the business cycle. I couldn't quite hear every word you said, so I might not have.
In the UK, when the Blair government ran a surplus, budget surplus, the Bank of England cut interest rates. So why did they do that then, and why aren't they cutting interest rates when the government deficit shrinks?
Okay, I don't know the UK data. I only know the US data.
Well, in case of the U.S., we had the Clinton surpluses, and right after that we had a recession, which is why the Fed lowered interest rates here, I think, because of the recession, which then sort of was right after the surplus or coincides with the surplus to some extent, right? So from a sectoral balance perspective, the surplus was, driving the recessionary pressures, and then the Fed had to sort of respond to that. I don't know if it might have been similar.
And we had a financial crisis.
Thank you for the presentations. I'd like to better understand the relationship between some of the price gouging, large profits from firms, and expectations of inflation. Are those driven? Are the increase in prices driven by actual inflation or potential increase in rates, and thus needing to offset cost of debt? And further, I'd like to better understand within the surveys for expectations of inflation, if there are differences you see from responses for firms that are, you could say, contribute largely to those increase in prices. Thank you.
Well, you will notice from the graph that I showed the spike in profits. And this is actually uniform. It's not only in the United States, it's also in Europe, especially if you look at the energy firms and other energy-related firms. It also has to do with the structure of the markets and whether there is a competitive pressures. And in particular case, as I said, there's no competition. either for domestically or from abroad. And it's a recognition that a number of people have said that from the Fed, that there is a channel that in the absence of competition, firms have the opportunity to raise prices. And an analysis of a paper that I cited, which is Storm paper, indicates that if you decompose the price components, you will see that the labor is the lowest possible component, and the highest component, of course, is the input of energy, but then the second one is profits. For instance, in terms of numbers, he has indicated that 38% is really due to profits.
There's, I think, also some evidence, the corporation, companies in their earnings calls where they have to be honest because they're talking to their shareholders, I suppose, because there are rules around that. They are saying that this is a great time to be raising prices because you have sort of the cover of inflation, right? So you're not the only company raising prices. Prices are generally going up. So then this gives you the opportunity to raise your prices above the increase in your costs, which is driving some of those increases in profit margins and the profits that companies are seeing. The graph that Randy showed, the short-term and long-term inflation expectations, that is from the Atlanta Fed survey, I think, which is surveying non-financial firms, which includes a mix of small and large firms. It's not the survey of economists. It's not the Treasury inflation protected securities versus the non-protected securities. That's one way you gauge inflation expectations. It's particularly surveying firms that are non-financial firms and small and big.
The only thing I was going to add, President Biden's office released a report on markups, and the markups have tripled since 1980. So there's a general trend, but now there's a huge spike because they're taking advantage, and they say our customers aren't going to retaliate against us because they know costs are going up.
Thanks. To what extent can we think of, and I know that MMT, I don't know if it outright just disregards the concepts of like monetary aggregates and even trying to measure the money supply, but to the extent that there might be some correlation, historically with increases in monetary aggregates and inflation, could that be reflecting sort of just like an increase in real costs that drives an increase in credit? For example, if you go from waiting 4 weeks to 4 months for a product to come in, presumably like you're going to need additional credit to fund that sort of working capital. So is that the correct way to sort of think about like the increase in the money supply?
Real quick. So money is a stock. Spending is a flow. So what you're trying to do is find if there's some relation between this stock and flow. Now, all spending has to be financed by definition, by money. All right? So you're measuring the stock of money at the end of the period. So say at the end of the year, the end of the month, the middle of the month, whatever. And all that stock represents is the amount of money that's been created but not destroyed yet.
But I think what you were getting at is that you could still have a correlation between the quantity of money and prices, but the causation is not going from money to prices, but the other way around. When prices are going up, then you have to get more credit, and so more credit means more money creation. So you can see that correlation, but in that sense, you could still ignore the monetary aggregates because they're not the causal factor; they're just the consequence. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a maybe naive question, but if either of you were in a position of power, in the position of Powell or someone at the Fed, what would you do right now? And I know that MMT has a much more structural and long-term approach and really changing to look at fiscal policy, etc. But then we heard, I think, one of the presenters, William Darity, really talking about some of the concrete pain points for people, businesses closing because of rising prices, etc. So how do you address those worries with concrete steps tomorrow, if you have to make a decision tomorrow? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't raise, or at least I wouldn't suggest that the central bank raises interest rates. The second thing is I will see exactly what the resources are and how those resources can be augmented, so we have differences in terms of the supply chains. And the other issue is what is the structure of the financial stance. And the financial stance, especially in the United States, it goes through various phases. President Biden, when he proposed a much higher budget, it was cut. And that's one of the problems that one will have. So these are some of the issues that one does.
I would say macroeconomically speaking, if you're trying to lower, spending and that way you're trying to get to lower prices, you could think of lowering military spending. Of course, you can't say that anymore. Medicare for all could be a disinflationary force. That's something I will talk about in the next period, that maybe people will be paying more for food, but they will be paying less for medications and medical services in general, so that it could be disinflationary, sort of more, I'm talking about a wish list, right? So you said I'm in power, so I'm doing it. Okay. So Medicare for all could be, disinflationary in that way. The capacity utilization shows that firms are not utilizing their capacity. So to the extent that you could incentivize them or with a carrot or a stick to do more of it, that's what businesses do. They restrict output to achieve higher profits. The problem in a capitalist economy is not that we are producing too little, but that we're too productive, right? So you have to limit that productivity so that you can sell output at prices that will deliver profits. So to the extent that you can sort of force the firms or incentivize them to use more of their capacity, I think that's something that I would do.
Okay, there isn't much the Fed could do. I would not have raised the interest rate. There's probably some evidence that housing markets were bubbling. The Fed has authority to get heavily involved in the mortgages. So I think that maybe it would have been a good idea to try to cool the housing market a bit. However, we also have a housing shortage. So what you want to do is build more houses, but maybe tighten up the lending against purchasing to stop the house prices from rising. And the Fed has the power to do that. There's probably not much else that they could do.
But I want to also say to you the following, that this easy question, what would you do if you were a policymaker, it doesn't actually hold. Having been in a position somehow to make this policy, nothing could be done. So therefore, you have to be careful when you ask, what would you do if you were empowered to do so? You're never empowered to do so.
Thank you. So it sounds like Randy, you were saying that most of the inflation is coming from oil and food and transportation and like food and transportation kind of come from oil. So that makes it sound like it's mostly coming from oil. And I'm curious, basically, you know, what your sense is of why oil prices are up and what there is to be done about that. And if it's mostly oil, does that mean that the price gouging and supply chain issues are kind of actually less significant if it's mostly oil? And then, you know, if there's kind of like this dynamic where the firms have this kind of like cover to continue raising prices, is that something that really needs to be addressed?
I'll take a little bit. Yeah, I think we do need to do something about pricing power. It seems like Biden administration is investigating, concerned with it. Whether they'll actually do anything, I'm a bit skeptical that it's going to happen. It's a long-term trend. It is a huge problem. We have in sector after sector, we have a very small number of firms that are price setters. On oil, so you know there was a large drop in demand for oil because people were not out driving around, and then it recovered faster than anyone expected that it would. I think that some of the refining was shut down, and it's taking time to fire it back up, you know, which could be planned in order to keep prices high for a while and get a lot of profits right now. The long-term prospects for oil are not good. And so trying to get the profits that you can get now.
Yeah, I think until about October of 2021, it was mostly demand that was driving the increase in supply, and supply was the prices, and supply was trying to catch up. But if I remember correctly, I think by November, October 2021, supply wasn't the driving factor in prices. It was the supply that was not catching up fast enough to, in case of oil. But obviously the long-term solution is to transition away from oil. I mean, it's 2022, we're still talking about oil. In 1970s, right, we had the oil price shocks, right, with driving inflation and so on. So hopefully in 2040 we won't be talking about oil driving inflation, although I'm not that optimistic about that.
Just kind of take a step back, I guess. Like, why does the Fed, I guess, keep raising rates if it doesn't seem to be an effective tool for combating inflation? Like, do you see it as a genuine sort of misunderstanding on the part of orthodox economics, or are there other sort of like political or economic motivations at play? Like, it's clear that like the unemployed like suffer from this, but I'm wondering who's benefiting, or like who does this policy serve?
The short answer is credibility. The public is expecting the Fed to do something. And in the absence of the Fed declaring impotence, then of course the question would be, what's its purpose? Now, in the paper that Randy and I have written, it says specifically what the Fed can do, instead of doing what it's doing. So it's a combination of politics, a combination of the credibility, and again, as I indicated, people like Larry Summers and others have said that you have to establish a target. But how this target is established is a big question, and therefore you increase interest rates or lower interest rates, thinking that you can hit that target, which is really artificial.
It's really since the 1970s, and with the Volcker experiment, that we come to this conclusion that the Fed should be in charge of inflation, and that inflation is a monetary sort of problem, and therefore the central bank should be in charge of that. And in a way, we haven't really developed any other tools to do anything about inflation, right? That we just say, well, the Fed is going to deal with it, and the Fed's only tool is the interest rate. So in a way, I don't even know if you can blame the Fed anymore, right? The head of the Council of Economic Advisors for Biden, she was on NPR, and she kept saying, well, whenever inflation came up, she said the Fed, the Fed. So in a way, it's a good way to push the blame from the administration and from the from Congress, from the fiscal policymakers, and onto the Fed, and that the Fed is supposed to do something about it.
Yeah, it's all part of the neoliberal game plan. So the elected representatives don't want to take responsibility over this. We'll leave it to this committee of experts that will decide, what the inflation rate ought to be, even though it has no tools in order to hit those. That Powell and the board waited so long to raise rates shows that they have some skepticism that they're going to be able to do anything about this. I think that's why they were so patient, and I think patience was the right policy. But as Dimitri said, eventually, if they just sit there, the media and the population will start to understand the Fed can't do anything about this. It has to be in somebody else's hands.
One more question.
And not only did they wait long, Powell actually lowered interest rates after he came into power, right? Because Yellen, I think in 2017 or whenever, they started raising rates. So when he came into, he became the chairman, he started lowering interest rates, and that was probably the right call at the time as well.
Well, even Christine Lagarde, as 2 months ago, has indicated that these price increases are not a driver for inflation.
Thank you. It's not a question so much as a referral. I don't know if you saw a Billy blog from Bill Mitchell about a month or so ago from Bloomberg. He did there's an interesting chart, an aerial photograph of all the container ships lined up trying to get materials into China and get them out of China. And that was just wanted to punctuate what you had said in your remarks about the bottlenecks that are happening, and that it's huge. When you look at the picture, it just blows your mind. So that's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's time for lunch.